Good afternoon, sir. For Belmont, hope you're doing okay. Here's a little video. Post the Promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Cultural Safety class today, week 3. Acknowledgement of country. Acknowledge that we're on the lands here at Belmont of the Awabakal people. Acknowledge elders, past and present, and any Aboriginal people here today, and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I just started with this brief overview or statement from the Fred Hollows Foundation website. A few facts: Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have on average 2.3 times the disease burden of non-Indigenous people. Life expectancy gap is still 10 years between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and almost half of Aboriginal men and over a third of Aboriginal women die before they turn 45, and I find that quite an alarming statistic, that one in itself. Started, and that was kind of leading into where we finished last week. Question 8, respond to the following 5 factors that contribute to ill health for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and 3 diseases that are more common in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community and the general population. We sort of did this as a whole and looked also at the next question, intergenerational trauma, and how that also links to health. So the idea of intergenerational trauma. We started with this little video, so have a listen to this.
The story of our communities, people and nation starts a long, long time ago. More than 60,000 years, in fact. This was when our culture and our law first started to thrive. We knew who we were and where we belonged. We took care of each other, our land and our waters. We ate food that made us healthy, lived on country and abided by our laws and song lines. Our families, our children were happy, with strong minds and hearts, because they were where they belonged. But then, everything changed.
Colonization came, bringing wars, disease, famine, violence, and the destruction and violation of our cultural laws, sacred sites, families, and communities.
We were denied our knowledge, language, ceremonies, and identity, the very things that tell us who we are and where we belong. And our connections with each other and the land grew weak.
And then, our children were taken from us. They had their names changed and their identities stripped away. They were told that Aboriginal people were bad. Worse still, they were told that their parents and grandparents did not want them.
For years this happened, and those children became known as the Stolen Generations.
Our children were denied love and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. This left very deep, very complex, and very real wounds, leaving scars that are still being felt personally, socially, spiritually, and collectively.
In the time when our story started, we were able to parent in the cultural way that has seen our families survive and thrive for generations. Our people were strong, and our culture flowed and healed us in times of hurt.
But since the trauma of colonisation and the stolen generations, we have not been able to heal in the same way. And we have unknowingly passed this trauma on to our children through sharing our sad stories and having them witness and experience our pain. This is known as intergenerational trauma, and we see symptoms today in broken relationships, disconnected families, violence, suicide, and drug and alcohol abuse.
But this is not where our story ends. We still have strong minds and hearts, and we still know who we were and where we belong. By creating safe and strong communities together, supporting our families to be free from pain, returning to our culture and building a strength of identity, we can stop the cycle of trauma and bring about positive intergenerational change, so that we can continue to thrive for the next 60,000 years. There are simple things that we can all do to help heal our trauma.
Visit healingfoundation.org.au to find out more.
Okay, so that sets the scene of what intergenerational trauma is, how trauma can impact on your health, mental and physical, and also that would impact on some of the issues that also I mentioned, like violence in relationships, perhaps turning to alcohol and other drugs as self-medication. So how did we get to this health crisis in a sense? So if we look historically, we've got invasion, erosion of traditional ways of life, culture and self-determination, being on the margins, racism, removal of children, poor access to employment, education equals poverty, and also those high costs of services. So on my little diagram, so that intergenerational trauma sitting up, if you like, so all this has happened before historically and still happening now. So let's just have a listen to this other longer video about intergenerational trauma and some of its expansions.
Imagine a line of well-being. You have ups and downs, and that's normal. Before colonisation, Aboriginal people also had their ups and downs, but overall our spirit was strong. Aboriginal people had a strong culture for tens of thousands of years. When the dominant culture arrived and they took over our land without our permission, the process of dispossession began. The loss of land and disruption to our way of life, ignoring the things most sacred to our culture, including our family kinship systems, language, traditional law, cultural practices, and looking after country. The dispossession brought massacres, poisoning, and disease. We lost our freedom, physical safety, and health, all of which impacted on our well-being. They introduced legislation and policies to assimilate us, with the ultimate aim to breed Aboriginal people out of existence. They even took our children from us. We lost the right to move freely in our own country and to see our family. We did not have access to legal systems. We were not allowed to get an equal education or receive equal health care. They took half our earnings and we had to get permission to marry. Our basic human rights were denied. All of this pain and loss can break your spirit. No matter where you are in the world, no matter what colour your skin is or how civilised you think you are, if people no longer have those basic human rights, their well-being will plummet. And this is exactly what happened to us as Aboriginal people. The well-being of whole families and communities through generation after generation suffered. Despite all of this, Aboriginal people endured. And through the resilience of our spirit, we survived. Slowly, policies and practices began to change, and the journey of our recovery begins. But it's not an easy thing to overcome, and many of our people are still living in a place of despair and hurt. When you are oppressed on such a large scale and for so long, a lot of despair builds up. Eventually, you start to normalise that. This is how it is for our people. The oppression has become internalised. When people go through trauma, they often rely on their family and friends to be the strong rocks that support them and help them to recover. But what happens when everyone around you is also going through the same trauma? Those rocks that you try to hold on to pull yourself up are also crumbling. And like all human beings, what we don't heal in our own lives, we sometimes pass on to our children. When there is internalised oppression and low well-being for generation after generation, along with a society that views you with negative stereotypes, racism and prejudices, it may lead to family violence, alcohol and drug use, incarceration, illness, mental health issues, and low emotional and social well-being, even suicide. Children who are born into this environment might not always have the same opportunities and may start to view the world as harsh and cold instead of feeling love, warmth and security. This is called intergenerational trauma. Now, don't get me wrong, our people are strong and resilient, and there are plenty of us living happy and healthy lives with strong connection to our families, community and culture. But many of us have family and friends who are struggling, and when we try to help pull them out, it can be very easy for us to get pulled back in. Let's think about the economy for a moment. The white man comes to our country, and with them they bring a whole new social and economic system. Our people were stopped from doing things our way, even though it had been working well for us for a long time. Yet we were also locked out of the new systems. This systematic exclusion from the economy and social systems throughout multiple generations has led to the many disparities in the social determinants of well-being that our people are challenged with today. Over time, there have been other cultures that have migrated to Australia, who have also been subjected to discriminatory legislation, like the White Australia policy. They too have experienced racism and discrimination. However, unlike our people, they were allowed to stay together, keep their children, maintain their cultural ways, and participate in the economy. Whereas our mob has only been allowed to participate in the last 40 to 50 years. As we can see, it's a big and complex challenge that we are facing. Even after the policies of colonisation ended, the trauma of these policies and practices still echo down the generations. I'm not talking about ancient history either. Some people say, it happened 200 years ago, get over it. Sure, the oppression may have started 200 years ago, but it has only started to change recently, less than 50 years ago. The last of the 1905 Act was only repealed in 1964 and the Native Welfare Act in 1972. So when were your parents born? When were you born? Many people living today are survivors of those oppressive legislations. The struggle to heal communities and achieve self-determination and equity takes time. The impacts of past policies are still felt today. And now we live in a contemporary society, but there are new policies and legislation that still impact negatively on Aboriginal people. We also need to change society's negative stereotypes and attitudes towards Aboriginal people. Participating in modern Australia shouldn't mean that we have to forget our culture. In fact, quite the opposite. We know that strengthening, reclaiming and reviving our culture and language builds our resilience and is healing for our people. Many of our mob are healing and living strong and healthy lives with a strong connection to our culture. We can still go hunting. We just might use a four-wheel drive to get there and be using the latest fishing rod instead of a spear. We can still have a strong spiritual connection to our country and the land. We can still speak our language, sing and dance, have ceremonies, paint our pictures and pass our stories to our young ones. We can still respect our elders, share tucker with our family and loved ones and care for our kin. We can maintain our cultural and social obligations to family, community and country and be respected as the first people of this nation. We can live and thrive in modern Australia as equals. That's what Aboriginal well-being is. So how long does it take for people to recover from this trauma and the lasting effects of colonisation and dispossession? Well, we actually do have some idea. Because unfortunately, people have been oppressing each other and inflicting trauma on each other's cultures all around the world for centuries. The evidence tells us that the impacts of trauma on the individual may be felt for many generations after the initial trauma. So if we know that on an individual level the trauma impacts on future generations, What are the effects of the trauma inflicted on a whole race of people for multiple generations? We can assume that it might take a lot longer to recover. But our people's spirit is strong, and we are recovering. However, it is important to remember that right now in Australia, we are smack in the middle of a transition phase. We know that recovering from colonisation and dispossession is a process that takes time. But through engagement, partnerships, and systemic change to attitudes and policies, we can speed this process up. What does this mean? It means recognition of Aboriginal people as the first people of this nation, engagement and partnerships to support Aboriginal-led community-controlled initiatives, building sustainability through increased education and workforce opportunities, addressing the social disparities and providing equitable access to services, ensuring that there is a broader understanding of Aboriginal culture and history in schools, universities and workplaces, providing culturally safe services that challenge racism, systemic bias and stereotypes, recognition and support for cultural strengths that contribute to well-being, helping to maintain, reclaim and revive Aboriginal culture and language, strengthen Aboriginal people's basic human right of self-determination and equity, and sharing the vision of all Aboriginal people living long, well and healthy lives.
So we come back to my paperwork, the factors contributing to the ill health. So you've got to come up with 5. But if you look holistically from all those things above there, any intergenerational trauma as a factor in itself, but you could include the government practices like removal. So this is going to contribute to ill health. So if you're, removed, disconnected, poor employment opportunities, racism, stereotypes, living on the margins, all those sorts of things that stem from initial invasion, then you're impacting on people with the idea, that you're sad, your mental health's bad, that self-medication, alcohol and other drug use, violence in relationships, all of those sort of things impact then onto other factors like, all right, so if your mental health's not great, or poor living conditions, or poverty, so your diet, there's a factor contributing on your overall health. If your diet is not so good, if you're not in a space to get enough exercise, perhaps being obese on that self-medication again, smoking, alcohol and other drugs, all those feed into some of those chronic health issues outlined. So that list 3, part B of 8, lists 3 diseases that are more common. So there we go, I've got the big list there: respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, kidney disease, heart disease, trachoma, so that's eyes and blindness. Fred Hollows worked in that space in terms of those eye operations that he was providing to Aboriginal communities, and glue ear is an issue amongst children too, and if undetected or undiagnosed can lead to being deaf, which is a big issue in classrooms in terms of engaging and learning if you can't hear properly, and then that link to being marginalised from education to employment. Intergenerational trauma, just this slide here, so trauma, so poor mental health and substance abuse we've spoken about, but issues with child health, and we've just touched upon that idea of hearing, speech and vision could be impacted upon. Poverty, housing, money concerns in terms of family functioning and support networks. So if other people in your network are in trauma or not functioning well, that you don't necessarily have good support networks. Perhaps, it leads to poor parenting practices, but just that exposure overall to racism and being on the margins. So that's impacting on setting up that trauma, and the idea of intergenerational trauma, so adults passing on that trauma to children. On the decision making, so that's that first slide in question 9. So particularly for children, if you're in that high stress environment, your survival instincts can kick in, and the flight or fight or heightened sense of arousal continuously, you're on the edge, you're wondering what's going to happen next, am I in danger, do I have to flee, all those sorts of things that might be the experience from a young age of children who are in families that are going through trauma. It could impact on healthy brain growth, according to Atkinson here. But your memory, ability to organise and remember details could be compromised from childhood. So that's going to impact on your ability to make decisions. Your adults with unresolved trauma. So we've gone through all that. But that can, your heart and your stroke and your cancer and your diabetes. Cancer is one that I don't think I mentioned previously. We did have mentioned alcohol, mental health, and violence, and that looks at that pathway into the juvenile justice and the adult correctional systems is certainly a byproduct in many ways of that unresolved trauma and the impact that can have on people's functioning. And so if we look at the communication and trauma, so that's the second part of that table in 9. So from that specific website cited below, Trauma Informed Services in Indigenous Australian Children, so willingness to trust and engage. So if you're in that high trauma environment, that level of mistrust and unwillingness to engage with mainstream services we've spoken about previously is a byproduct of trauma and communication. And if your brain is impaired because of trauma, again, that ability to remember stuff and communicate appropriately can be compromised. Understanding and retention and the link to trauma. Just that idea again of memory and retaining information as a byproduct of being in that high state of arousal and tension, not being able to concentrate, pay attention, and just impacting on understanding generally. That could be certainly the experience, imagine, in school, and I guess not unlike ADHD in some ways, but just trying to engage and concentrate and think. Okay guys, that should take us through to question 10. List 2 current federal and 1 current state piece of legislation, that's law, aimed to ensure cultural safety for Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people in the workplace. So federal legislation, that's also could be called Commonwealth legislation or Australian legislation. So the first one I've got here is the Racial Discrimination Act. So that's Commonwealth or federal or Australian law. So it applies to the whole of Australia, not just you could be in any state, but it's against the law to exclude people from workplaces or education based on their colour, their race, their heritage, and allowed to talk about those groups, diverse groups, based on hate speech, based on race, colour, descent, etc. All that sort of stuff is inbuilt into that, and really important around employment and access to housing, renting, all those sorts of things would come under that Racial Discrimination Act. So you really only got to name the act. Another Australian or Commonwealth legislation, Human Rights Commission Act 1986. So again, it's Australian legislation, and really that is about ensuring, investigating complaints of breaches against human rights. So again, that could be based on your cultural difference. So you might have heard about the Australian Human Rights Commission. There's a website you could look at there and talks about what they do, but where complaints are investigated and dealt with. Commission against that Human Rights Act. Another federal or national piece of legislation, Native Title Act 1993. This is the Eddie Mabo case, if you like, which in a sense proved that terra nullius, that Australia was a vacant land not being used, was wrong, and it sort of opened the doors for Aboriginal people to make land rights claims, but the land has to be not being used and has been vacant and empty or not being used for any other, commercial or residential purposes. And Aboriginal people need to show that they've maintained that lifelong connection, that historical and current connection to the land, ongoing and unbroken connection. It does guide, claims for land, but it's very doesn't certainly open up, claiming land here, there and everywhere, Certainly very restrictive and guided. Some New South Wales legislation, and I think it only asks for one. There's the New South Wales Aboriginal Language Act, fairly recent, 2017, and it acknowledges the significance of Aboriginal language. I think what's important there is that we're starting to see more Aboriginal language organisations and courses being taught. Certainly in TAFE in Western New South Wales around Dubbo, there's Aboriginal language courses. Certainly locally in Newcastle, there's an organisation that is teaching and working with the local Awabakal language in particular. Miramar is the organisation, and yeah, but we've heard examples from people in class about their schools doing things like singing the national anthem in a Awabakal. Here's a little action, Commonwealth Government action. It's not a law as such, but it's important to note. The Closing the Gap initiative. So that's where, you know, I guess the statistical measures, how Aboriginal people are faring each year in terms of education as children and childhood, through to secondary and tertiary education, employment outcomes, death rates, health, all those sorts of things. So it's not a law, but it's a government initiative and an action that's been ongoing, and certainly guides and informs if we're doing a good job or a better job. Certainly need to do a better job. And also the last one, again, it's not a law as such, the Reconciliation Action Plan. It's a thing that organisations implement. So TAFE has got one off the ground, not as quick as some organisations, but you can be a little organisation like, let's say, Samaritans or a neighbourhood centre. You can get your own little Reconciliation Action Plan to inform your organisation and how to work best with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, First Nations people. A Reconciliation Action Plan. I'm mentioning this because it is significant and important in workplaces, but it's also something that our next assignment, our practical side of things, we'll look at developing basically a Reconciliation Action Plan when we get to that one. So I thought it was worth mentioning. So that takes us to the last question. List 4 strategies you would use to involve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the planning and service delivery of your program. So I guess we're taking the perspective, it's probably a non-Aboriginal service, the way that question has been written. But it could be an Aboriginal specific service. However, I guess it's more applicable to interpret this question that it's a non-Aboriginal service, and you're going to come up with a program. It doesn't say what the program is, but we want to involve Aboriginal people in the thinking behind what you come up with. So let's say it's a program to work with young people, perhaps, who are not attending school, as an example. But we want, I guess we're in that example, we may have some young Aboriginal people potentially in that program, so we really got to involve the Aboriginal community in how that would be set up, and that's important. So how do we do that? I'll let you have a think, but I mean, how do we listen to the voices? Do we talk informally with local Aboriginal people? Some of the elders, perhaps. Do we have more formal meetings? And we're looking at how to set up a formal meeting with our agendas and thinking through who we invite and bouncing agendas off them. But yeah, it could be a more formal meeting with Aboriginal elders again, or community, as well as Aboriginal services, getting the input from specific Aboriginal services that I'd mentioned in one of my videos, places like the land councils, Marook up Port Stephens, Darkinjung down Central Coast, Butterbar around Belmont, Swansea. Getting input from those people might be very, very important, as well as there's an Aboriginal family service called Mullumbimba. That would be good. Who else has Aboriginal committees and people? Well, schools do. They have Aboriginal workers, and they have advisory committees in a lot of cases. Thinking more broadly, who do we employ as an organisation? Have we got Aboriginal people working as volunteers and or paid staff? So it really is important that Aboriginal people are employed in all organisations, particularly community services, so involving our Aboriginal staff. Perhaps we have a Reconciliation Action Plan. I just mentioned that earlier. Does that set out guidelines for how to involve and work with Aboriginal people? And I guess the RAP sets up things about how inviting is your organisation. How does it look? Has it got Aboriginal art, welcome information around language, perhaps? That's the planning. And then in the service delivery, once your program's up and running, getting that feedback, hearing from the participants, if we have Aboriginal people participating, getting their feedback and their specific ideas about how engaging, how welcoming, and what could be done better. Reviewing with Aboriginal staff, and again the broader Aboriginal community, whether it is the elders or parents or other people in the community, getting that feedback as the program progresses, and as well perhaps looking at our Reconciliation Action Plan. If we don't have one, have we developed it? And if we have it developed, are we meeting the milestones and the things that we're saying that we're going to do? having a review. So some sort, and maybe it's some sort of fun events, some sort of, let's come and have a barbecue or something to eat, something informal and relaxed, setting a nice atmosphere if you like, and then having those informal chats in that environment, attending Aboriginal specific celebration of events, NAIDOC, etc., etc. All of those would work. That would take us through to the end of that question. There is one little bonus little video I did find recently from NITV, and it's around that idea of cultural safety. I will put that in here, and I think that's important to again review that idea of cultural safety from an Aboriginal perspective. And I like the idea that this is presented from the idea of even the sporting field as a workplace, if you like, certainly for professional people, but it's certainly a place in the community. But how welcoming and culturally appropriate is it? And they draw on the experience of Adam Goodes in particular, who was basically booed in his workplace and booed into submission and retirement. Anyway, thanks for your time, and toodle pips.
A culturally safe space is one in which a person feels equal and valued, and their culture is acknowledged and respected. For our mob, it means a place where there is no denial of our identity, challenge to our history, or assault on our culture.
Our mob's culture is strong, and football is woven into it. It's in our blood. It binds our communities, so it's vital footy is a safe cultural space.
The ovals, the club rooms and the stands must be places where people come together for the love of the game, what each player brings to the team and what each connected family brings to the club. Football clubs, if done right, become places of belonging. A football club family.
There's a bloody good reason so many of our mobs shine when our culture is celebrated. Ask Eddie Betts, who kicked goal of the year twice in Sir Doug Nicholls' round. Doesn't take a genius to work out that if we feel equal and valued, we can perform at our peak.
Just like Lance Franklin, who has the whole football world willing him to 1,000 goals. Just 20 to go, buddy.
Good things happen in safe cultural spaces. Empowerment flows. From being able to safely represent who you are and where you come from.
There is no doubt we would have more Indigenous players in the league if racism wasn't so prevalent.
Imagine the league we would have, the players we would see. From personal experience, when I was at Swan Districts in Perth, it was one of the happiest times of my life. Why? Because I was accepted for who I was and made to feel so welcome. And I was able just to focus on footy. That's what happens when you feel valued and included.
Building safe cultural spaces starts with being accepting of someone's differences.
It only takes a split second to make someone feel unwelcome, and a split second for someone to put it right. By standing up, showing support and stamping out racism when they see it or hear it straight up.
Because every time racism rears its ugly head, the game risks losing someone. If you can't feel safe whilst playing the game, quite simply, you'll stop playing, and the game will lose its exhilarating Indigenous essence and unique brand of play.
That's how we lost Goodsy. I wonder who else we lost along the way. I wonder how many brilliant juniors were forced to turn their backs on a space that didn't accept them, and in some cases, turn them into someone else they didn't want to be.
The players and the league are making great gains in building safe spaces. The peak rule is a significant part of that, especially because it protects players at local levels too.
Though we all have a part to play, at under-12s, at local games, or in the outer of the G, if you see it, hear it, or read it online, call it out. Because there's only one way to build a truly safe cultural space, and that's together.
The rewards are everyone's to share. This is Yokkai Footy.